This week we read two different things. We read On Liberty. We did the first and fourth chapter, and then we read the Communist Manifesto. For the first reading, overall, I really thought it was good. It was kind of dense and hard to understand, but it was really interesting. On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, I feel like his work, I liked it a little bit better than the second one we read because I feel like he backed up his claims with more logical arguments, and even offered better counter arguments than we see in the Communist Manifesto. And I also think that he appeals to lots of like moral concern and arguments more than some other things, which is a good perspective that I really like to see in lots of papers. And I see his attempt to appeal to the people and their best interest, which I really liked, and I think he used that morality to do that. I don't fully agree with everything that he said, and I think overall his writing was good, but I think I would definitely need to research and learn more about him, and I would love to read his works in the future and read more of his stuff. And I did kind of look at a little bit of his like other beliefs, which is really interesting, and a little bit more about like who he was, and he's got lots of very opinionated, I would say more like liberal, quote unquote, ideas, which were very interesting to read and look at. So if you have time, those are cool to look at. I did put a summary on my outline that you guys can look at if you want. But some interesting concepts I have four. An interesting concept was the harm principle concept, which is when a government can restrict the freedom that someone has if they're causing harm or issues with a group of people or someone, and that's the only time that the government can really step in, pretty much is how he words it. I also thought it was interesting that he thought the biggest threat to liberty was not government, but it was social pressure. And then I thought the way that he divided the domains of life was interesting. He divided them as self-regarding and others regarding. The self-regarding was the ones that affected someone personally and didn't have an effect on society, and then the others were bringing harm to others, and that's when society will and could step in. And then he talks about later on how society isn't supposed to interfere in personal matters, but I feel like this doesn't always make sense and can't always be true. So where is that line drawn? I was just thinking like when people are doing these like harmful behaviors, that kind of thing, or inflicting like issues that will hurt themselves, like addictive behaviors, if that makes sense. So I guess that could be one of my questions. And then my actual questions, do you think that society can pressure people for behaviors that harm them and don't necessarily harm others, because they're very focused on as long as it's not harming others, then it's okay, throughout this work? But also, do you think that when do you think society is justified in disciplining someone for a behavior or action, and what do you think is more dangerous, social pressure or governmental power? I kind of think that that's a very dense thing to really break down, and I think if you're arguing governmental power, it would just be like the extreme governmental power, and it would really have to be, for social pressure, extreme social pressure. So I don't know, I feel like that's kind of a hard thing to look at. And then the Communist Manifesto, I've heard lots of things about this. I was talking to my family and my boyfriend about this one, and they had very mixed opinions. None of them liked it, but I wanted to discover it for myself because I had never read it before. So I did include a summary of what I read, and if you guys want to look at that, you can. So overall, this is kind of my opinion. And then I'll go into some things I thought were confusing. I feel like his overall goal doesn't make too much sense with communism. I understand what he's trying to achieve, but for there to be no government, class, or private ownership just doesn't seem feasible to me. Like, I don't understand how that would even function. I feel like he's just so, his head is in the clouds pretty much. Like, he's so, like, desiring this thing that's not even achievable, or attainable. And I feel like freedom isn't something that we can ever truly attain, by ourselves. So for him to be like, oh, we'll just all have this freedom, I don't really agree with that. And also just this whole idea just seems like it would just go to straight chaos. Even though he's arguing like everything's gonna like have a revolt, like the classes are gonna revolt with this capitalist society. I feel like the way he's talking about the communist society, that's where it's gonna cause all this chaos and these issues. But as far as freedom, I feel like everything comes from something somewhere, or sacrifice, or even someone. And the idea of communism isn't something that I've fully studied for myself, but from what I researched, because I decided to research more about who he was, and like more about like the communist ideas and like different people in history that were more like communist leaning, sorry. It just doesn't seem realistic or wise. I feel like his ideas, especially in this, were just like I said earlier, just big, elaborate, not planned out well. And he just wanted to turn everything like upside down on its head in a way that just didn't have a good plan. I also feel like the way that he viewed religion, which this is not something that we read, but I researched it, but he kind of looked at religion as like something that tied people down in politics. He really didn't like Christianity. I thought that was something that was interesting to note. That'd be something cool to research if you guys have time, but I really want to kind of look into his story a little bit more and learn more about him, because I thought that there was lots of interesting things to learn from him. And then some interesting, confusing concepts. I thought that when I was first reading, Marx meant that all property had to be abolished when he was talking about like the private property. And I was confused because I thought that that didn't seem right or fair. It didn't seem to me like it was okay for people to just lose the things that they had worked so hard for and like achieved in their lives. But I figured out he meant like production, like means of production. So like if someone were to be working or owning a factory and like had all these workers, like that was not okay, kind of thing. And then he didn't want one person owning like this big business and then having all these people working for them, kind of thing. So I just kind of had to like figure out what that meant. Also thought it was kind of interesting that he believed history was driven by materialism and material things. He talked about how everything goes back to money and goes back to what people own or who they know or what they work for or do. He said that that shapes everything else, and I don't really feel like that's something I ever thought about before. And then the way he talks throughout his writing makes it seem like revolting is the only option with this capitalist society. And he seems just so opinionated on one side, and he's not giving, like, I know he gave some counter arguments through like the fourth, not the fourth, but sorry, I was getting it mixed up with the last thing, but he did give some counter arguments, like some rebuttals to common like things that people argue against communism, but I feel like he wasn't fully explaining them well, and I feel like they weren't valid arguments, which is just my opinion. So if y'all have any disagreements with that, that's fine. But he doesn't seem to give the full picture. I feel like if he gave a stronger counter arguments and like backed those up, it would make his argument better. And then my questions were, do you think a society without private ownership, classes, or government could function, and why? Or even if it just didn't have one of those three, even if it had two of them and then just didn't have government, or if it just had private ownership and government and had no classes or whatever. And then how do the two readings that we looked at have different perspectives on freedom specifically? And then where do you think that Marx and Mill would have similar viewpoints, if any, and where would they completely disagree on I had different things like government, people, growth, private property, economics, liberty, ideas of equality, and social society versus individualism.